webinar, Process-Based Audits, Evaluating Effectiveness and Driving Improvement. My name is Karen Rawson. I'm from the DESARA Group, and I've been involved with companies as a professional trainer, working with registrar auditors, quality managers, internal audit teams, and I've consulted with a number of companies for quality management systems certification and revitalization. I've also been an author of TL 9000 for over 10 years now, and I've got an MBA in quality management. You can actually get that along with a bachelor's in industrial engineering and operations research. So I'm one of those people who's actually doing what my degree was for in college. Who ever knew, right? But I love working with companies to improve effectiveness overall. I'll tell you a little bit about our company before we get started and put some of the advertising up front, and then it's right into the content. The DESARA Group works with companies in leading quality and improving business effectiveness. That's really our sweet spot. We work with business process improvement. We work with the leadership in establishing objectives and saying, what are we going to do differently to meet our customers' needs? And where I often intervene with organizations is in the implementation of management system standards. And I do tailored, customized training and work with establishing effective systems. What we find is sometimes when you send people off to a class, if there's not that hands-on coaching that goes right along with it, it's hard to get the full benefit out of what they learned in class. So I go in and intervene. I'm working with a client right now. I'm going to give you some examples of it to show you how we work with clients to achieve their objectives. Commercials up front, I want to tell you, mark the date in your calendar, June 29th, 30th, and July 1st. We're going to have a 3-day virtual industry conference. I think a lot of people on this call feel cost-constrained. They never get to travel. They'll see these cool conferences come up over their mail, and they'll say, gee, I wish I could go. We have come up with a conference that's going to be $797 per site license. That means you can sign up and invite all your friends to join you in your cube, in your office, or in a conference room. For about 20 people, then it gets a little unwieldy in a conference room. But we're going to have a conference on increasing personal, team, and organizational productivity, effectiveness. First day, personal productivity. Second, team productivity. And third day, organizational productivity. I have been lining up really cool speakers, and we're going to be going through some of the best books, business books on the subject, some of the applications in government, in healthcare, in business of all types, and I'm just really excited about what we're going to be doing. You'll be getting emails about this. Start asking your boss if you can attend a conference from your own desk or from your own conference room, in and out as you need, no time away from work, no travel. Second ad, those of you who are on this call probably have an interest in how to make your audit programs more effective. Well, once again, we understand that people have a hard time getting away from business, hard time traveling. On May 25th and 26th, very reasonably priced, I believe it's $597, a 2-day class. It's all day, so you got to lock yourself in a conference room or work from home. A 2-day virtual training course. It's as if we're in the room together, and we're going to go through the stuff in here as well as tools and templates and exercises that will help you support serious audit program improvement. This is for audit program managers who want to lead distinguished audit programs. I hope you'll attend. You will get, those of you who participate in this call will get special advance purchase discount in an email next week. That's it for the commercials. Now into the content. What we promised in this webinar is we were going to go through what management really wants to know, which is if our audits are so great, why do we keep having quality problems? So what are the leaks that are costing us money? And what are the audits going to tell us that we don't already know? And what's it worth to fix the problems that our audits have already raised? I'm not going to tell you the horror story number 1 right now. I'm going to save that for the big class in May because I found we ran out of time last time when we led this webinar. I asked you guys when you enrolled, and I've done this in other enrollments, and I've kind of been keeping this poll, how effective are your internal audits at identifying important findings? 91% of survey respondents say that really we're less than fully satisfied with what our audits are telling us. So let me ask you, who would pay for a satisfaction rate like this? No wonder it's hard to get internal auditors to participate. No wonder it's hard to get management's attention when they say, you know what? Our audits really aren't very effective at telling us something that we don't already know or pointing us in a direction of something that we'd like to learn. Yeah, they're somewhat effective. We get a little bit here and there, but would you really pay for it? What I want you guys to have is the ability to go in, and when you perform an audit, they say, wow, that gave us some payback. I'm glad we took the time to do that audit. You guys, that is the feeling that I get when I go in and I do audits, gap assessments. I did one last week that was just astonishing to management when they realized the things that their audits were missing. Okay, the way we're going to go through this webinar, we're going to start with a theory, some basic definitions, the audit methods, who audits what, how do they audit, what is a process-based audit, what's the basic methodology that we're talking about here that may be different from going out with a checklist that your registrar may have given you that says, do you fulfill the requirements of ISO 9001 or whatever standard you're auditing to. Maybe you're doing environmental management auditing. Second thing, I'm going to give you some tips, and in the two-day class, we're going to get more than tips. We're going to get practice with this, but how to perform audits that evaluate the effectiveness and drive improvement. We'll be going through actual examples that I've seen in companies that say, wow, what can we do differently in this business? What are we seeing we're performing, and how can we do it differently? I'll show you a little bit of it right here, enough of it that you can go say, wow, how can I use that in my real life? It says that the bonus is the preview of additional content. I'll just be covering that with you in the as we go through here. Now, by the way, throughout the presentation, if you do have a question, just raise your hand. I think we've got few enough people on the call that I can take questions as they come, or you can write them down if they don't seem pertinent to what's on the slide right there, and I'll answer those at the end of the call. And I do stay on the call at the end for anyone who'd just like to talk about anything afterwards. I've got some time afterwards. We'll stop the recording and we'll just continue to visit. Now for the theory. We'll blow through this. An audit is a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which criteria are fulfilled. That means that your generic audit purpose is to collect objective evidence so that you as an auditor can make an informed judgment about the status of the quality management system. One question that I always get when I'm running an audit class is, well, how big a sample do you have to take? The answer is right there on the generic audit purpose. Enough to allow you to make an informed judgment. You're taking a sample, snapshot in time. It's the limitation of an audit. You may miss something. Okay? Let your client know that up front. You've done your best to take an unbiased sample, but in your best opinion, this is what you're getting out of it. You may have seen all the negative stuff. You may have seen all the positive stuff. But if you take a big enough sample, you'll be pointing them in a direction. I want to talk about systematic, independent, and documented process. Just a little bit right here. The systematic means you've gone out and you've planned. What am I going? When am I going there? What am I going to go through? You don't just go out and wander around and try to see what you see. You are working towards a checklist, toward a standard, toward a methodology that you, in your organization and in your experience, have come up with. It says, I'm going to be able to get through everything I need to get through in this audit. Independent. Later on in this call and in the two-day class, we're going to talk a lot about how independence is different from ignorance. I don't want to see accountants auditing software development with no information about what it takes. No, I'm not talking about experience developing software. I'm talking about an understanding of the process. You need to be independent of it, but you need to study the process. And then you need to objectively determine whether criteria are fulfilled. That means you need to understand the criteria you're auditing against. Not that you need to be an expert in what ISO 9001 or whatever criteria you're auditing to requires, but you certainly need to know what good looks like. And part of what the criteria are, we're going to talk about what other criteria besides an international standard may be. The old school, late 80s and 90s, say what you do what you say. But what you're doing when you audit now, you're auditing for say what you do what you say. Are they measuring it, and are they improving it? So what you're looking for is whether the process is defined, whether the process is actually implemented. Do people do what's written down? Do people follow the process as it's been defined, rather than all their little improvements I say in air quotes, that they've made about what's a better way to do it? They may have better ways, so let's work that into the process. And then does the process produce what it's expected to produce? And do the records exist to verify how the process was performed. You know, if you simply look, say you have a contract manufacturer build some stuff for you, and it comes out great every time. Are you going to look behind the curtain and see how they're getting that? I mean, are they getting it with incredible amounts of rework? Are they getting it with properly trained people? Are they inspecting quality in, or are they actually using quality processes? Or if you're buying product, if your customers are buying from you, are you following the process as it was defined, or are you doing it by brute force? So those are some of the things that on the last slide that talks about what are you looking at in an audit. Now, who gets audited? I'm going to go through some of the basic requirements of ISO 9001 right here, and who's supposed to be audited. Well, in ISO 9001, it says that you have to audit to verify compliance and to verify effectiveness. That means that every process within the scope of registration needs to be audited. But you do have leeway as to how often you audit those based on the status and importance of each of those processes. Status and importance. We're talking about things like, has there recently been a major change? Have you merged two areas of the business together? Have there been new managers, a big influx of contract employees who have come in to work on a process? New product introductions. Okay, when it says status, it may be that you don't want to do it the first day the new manager arrives. Probably bad timing. You may give a little shift to your schedule to accommodate that. Major changes, you may want to go in more frequently. Process that's largely unchanged over a long period of time, very few problems, may be something that you audit once a year instead of every quarter. You may do a greater level of sampling where there's been a lot of change, a longer audit maybe than if it were something that was very stable. So 8.2 of ISO 9001 gives you some leeway as to who gets audited and how often, but everything does need to be audited, and you're looking for the effectiveness of the process. Another question I get, are our customers required to audit us, or are we required to audit our suppliers? The answer is no. ISO 9001 Clause 7.4 says that you have to choose suppliers according to established criteria. And that means your company, your organization gets to establish the criteria. And it doesn't say you have to audit them. However, that's one of the ways that companies often find out how's that supplier getting the results that we're getting out of them. I've had so many people say, oh, well, we simply have a checkbox on the new supplier identification, new supplier startup plan that says, are you ISO 9001 certified? And if you are, you don't have to get audited. Let me tell you, folks, there are ISO 9001 certificates and ISO 9001 certificates. I just went into a company that has been ISO certified for 10 years, and they showed me how they really do things around there. It would raise your hair. It was scary. You know, they're saying, why do we have this certificate and we're still having quality problems? I'll tell you, it's because they're not following what was written down. They're not following the documentation they basically bought. And that was a wake-up call to management. So ISO 19011 gives guidance on how to perform audits, but it does not describe process-based auditing. So who are the auditors and who audits what? Well, the guidelines in ISO 19011, which is ISO's definition of how do you perform audits, says here's information for registrars, for supplier auditors, and for internal auditors. And it says that in ISO 9001, it says that the selection of auditors and the conduct of audits shall ensure the objectivity and impartiality of the audit process. You can't audit your own work. Audits have to be conducted by people who are not involved. By the way, I'm quoting ISO 9004, which is a guidance document, and it says audits have to be performed by people who aren't involved in the activity so that they can be independent. But let me tell you, independence does not equal ignorance. Now, here I am going to tell you horror story number 2. Company had a problem with their audits. They called me in to train their internal auditors, to retrain their internal auditors. They felt the problem was training because the registrar said your audits are kind of worthless. So I sat down with their 4 auditors. We were going to have a class, and I realized that they had an accountant, a facilities manager, an assistant to the vice president, you know, an administrative professional, and the quality manager. none of them really understood the basics of quality management systems. None of them understood the processes they were auditing because, get this, it was a software development company. So you had an accountant auditing software development, and she had no idea what it meant to go through the various steps of developing software. So when you are independent, that doesn't mean you can only audit areas you know nothing about. You have to study the process. And that's what we're going to talk about in the practical part of this webinar. Now, what gets audited? ISO 9001 Clause 8.2 says you have to audit 4 things. First of all, whether the quality management system conforms to its own planned arrangements. Back in Clause 5 of ISO 9001, it says top management has to come up with a quality policy, quality objectives, plans for achieving those objectives, and it has to provide, in Clause 6, it talks about providing the people and the facilities and infrastructure to achieve those goals. All right, so they set up goals in advance. They say, here's what we're promising our customer, because they understand customer focus. That's all set up. If you're doing your business right, that's what ISO 9001 says you have to do up front. In Clause 7 of ISO 9001, it says you have to plan your processes. So what 8.2, Clause 8.2 says and what you're going out to audit is, hey, are we doing what we set out to do? Set up by management, set up by the way we planned our processes. So you could have a whole bunch of things that you've specified beyond the requirements of ISO 9001. You're auditing all those planned arrangements and those goals. Next, you have to audit the requirements of ISO 9001. Do you have the documented systems and the records to back up what you're doing? Do you meet the requirements of the model that ISO 9001 sets up? You have to look at your own management system requirements. And fourth, when you audit, you're auditing to see whether the management system is effectively implemented and maintained. So it's not enough to make sure documents comply with the standard. I can't tell you how many times I look through auditors' notes and I see check, 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 without telling me whether that just because something was out there, is it effective? Is it meeting your own planned arrangements? Is it meeting the goals that management set up for it? When we get into the practical section of this audit, I'm going to tell you how you go about doing that. And that idea of making sure you're effectively implemented and maintained, that's what the 2-day course is all about. How do you know if it's actually effective? All right, so when you audit, a little more piece of theory here, what requirements matter? It's not just ISO 9001. All right, let's think about what a quality management system is set up to do. Well, it's set up to make sure that the customers are getting what they want. That's really why most companies certify to ISO 9001 or any other standard for that matter is the customer says, thou shalt certify, and then we won't come and audit you, or thou shalt certify, and then you're allowed to bid on the job. And then it becomes within the company, we're going to certify so we get an outside opinion of how we're doing, or because this model is good for us. But typically, companies that don't have customers requiring it don't certify. They may have a management system, but they don't necessarily get that outside judgment. So really, when you're auditing, what you need to be looking for is, are you meeting the customer, what the customer wants for product specifications, what the service performance they want, what the delivery requirements are. You're also auditing for, are you meeting what the business set up for itself? They've got strategic goals for financials, for brand and market position, for corporate policies. You're auditing to see, are we meeting those things that the business set up, not just do we do what the ISO 9001 manual, compliant quality manual and procedures say. When you go out to audit, you're going to make sure that all those things that are written down in the supplementary documentation about the way we do things around here that have to do with the environmental health and safety stuff, the transportation stuff, the government agencies, those things are probably incorporated into individual procedures that people are following. So when you're auditing, you're actually looking at, are we following the laws? And as a knowledgeable person of the process, you must have some knowledge about what those laws are. You'll be looking at those to the extent that they're included in the scope of the audit. And then you may also be looking at standards for workmanship, for interoperability standards, for example, for certifications that the company may need to maintain. Are they applying and using the labeling properly there? This theoretical diagram shows how you're actually auditing. And this comes from our webinar that Rod Bothwell, my partner, has just been presenting on the aerospace industry. Get this, folks. The aerospace industry has just gotten with the program and said, we're not going to audit the checklists anymore. We're going to audit processes. Well, experienced, effective auditors have been auditing processes all along, but the documentation they had to fill out was very checklist-based. So they're going through and they're retraining auditors through industry, working with registrar auditors and internal auditors to teach them the process approach to auditing. And this is how it works. Typically, when you are taught how to audit, the basics are you look at the inputs, you look at the outputs, what's required of the process, the steps in the process, and you say, are we following the steps? Well, what you need to be looking for is the effectiveness. Not just are we following the steps, but in the process approach, you're looking at, are we effective? Are we getting the outputs that we want? Do we have evidence of effectiveness? Does the output look like what it's supposed to look like in terms of achieving goals? Evidence of conformity is all those records that say we did what we intended to do. And in the process approach to auditing, you have to both look at, you've got audit records that show, are we auditing to make sure these things happen? And that's what your third-party registrar should be looking at for you. Do you have the records that show that you performed a process approach to audit? And are you using effective tools for auditing? So when we go into the two-day class, we talk about what are those records you need to keep and what are some effective tools for performing process-based audits. In a typical audit class, you're focusing right in here. And we do have these internal audit classes. We'll be offering a virtual audit class on just the basics of what does the standard say and how do you plan, execute, report, and close an audit. That'll be offered in July. A little bit more theory here. What is an effective process? Well, here are 4 things that auditors can look for. Planned activities, they're not done, and the desired results are not achieved. Obviously, that's not an effective process. Or the planned activities are not done, but you get the results. Let me tell you, that's how many times, that's what I often hear from people who specialize in the diving catch. Hey, we took some shortcuts, but look at the results. The end justifies the means. No, that is not an effective process because it depends on the people with the calibrated eyeballs and the ability and willingness to work overtime and to investigate things that just, are not necessarily their job to make sure that the results were achieved. Or how about the planned activities are done, but the desired results aren't achieved? You can show me reams of data that show that you tested everything, but you've got a high customer complaint rate. Reams of training records. We had a corrective action. We retrained the people, but, the thing happens again. No. The effective process is the one that says planned activities are done and the desired results are achieved. If you're getting your results through the dive and catch, or if you're simply doing everything on the page and you are, and this is what frustrates management, we've got this documented system, but we constantly have to work around it, you don't have an effective process. The biggest thing you can provide as an auditor is making sure that that 4th line there, planned activities are done and desired results are achieved, is what's happening. So you're going to tell management, not just are we doing planned activities, but did we get the results? And not just what they already know, here are the results we're getting. You're saying, did they follow the process as defined? One of the things you'll do as an auditor, as an audit program manager, what an effective audit program manager ought to be doing, is going back through the results that the company is getting and saying, should we be sprinkling in a few more audits here where we're not getting the results? People say we're doing what we're supposed to do, but we're not getting the results. So look at that when you go in. We're going to talk about, particularly in the 2-day class, and I'll touch on it here in this quick webinar, how do you know whether a process is effective? Well, in the definition that comes from, most people are familiar with ISO 9001. There's a supplementary document, ISO 9000. It's the glossary for ISO 9001 and the related standards. Effectiveness means the extent to which planned activities are realized and the results are achieved. That's what you're looking for. And if you can teach your audit team to look at those 2 things, then you've got an audit program that will make management management sit up and listen. It'll make people respond to the findings that you have. It will get more support from senior staff, which is what most people are actually looking for when they participate in an audit. They say, why did I do this if no one's going to listen? You need to look at both pieces. Okay, we're going to finish up on theory here in a second, and we're going to go into what do you actually do to perform an effectiveness-based process audit, a process-based effectiveness audit. How audits are performed, what we teach in a basic audit class. This is what we cover in the July class we'll be having on internal audit skills, basic audit skills, what does management need to know in terms of the auditors are coming. Overall audit program management sets up a system where audits are planned, executed, reported upon, and then closed. So most people probably have a basic idea for how this works, but what you want to know in this call and in the process-based audit class is how do we improve our practices so that we get the improvement and don't just have a record that we did all of our internal audits. Okay, I want to start with improving audit program management because, like this diagram showed, you can't plan, execute, report, and close an audit if you don't have an ongoing, well-managed audit program. People are kind of floundering out there trying to get attention for what they've been assigned to go do. Now, ISO 9001 Clause 4.2.2 requires you to determine your key processes. Your key processes all need to be audited. If you're not auditing all the key processes on a regular basis, you're out of compliance with ISO 9001. Next, you determine what are the applicable requirements of the standard you're auditing to each of those processes. You don't go out and you just say, well, I'm going to audit Clause 751 today. That's ridiculous. 751 says we perform our jobs according to procedures. Well, you can't go out and audit Clause 751 because that would mean you're going to go out and audit the entire company, boil the ocean. So when you look at a process, you say which requirements apply here. Next, you determine what other requirements may apply, something that the customer has put on you, the laws, the corporation itself, or your own management team have put upon that process. And then you set up a requirements matrix to show which requirements pertain to which key processes. Right. That four-step process is something that we train people again and again, and I reinforce when I go in to work on audits with my clients, go in and reinforce on them, do you know which clauses apply, and do you understand what those clauses of the standard say is good enough? I mean, you can't just tell me somebody shows you a procedure and, yep, I guess that meets it. So here's an example of a business, of key processes of a business. And if you don't have them, if you haven't seen a map like this that's underlying your audit program management, you need to go find one or you need to pencil one out and make sure that this is the way your audit program is set up if you want to have process-based audits. Typically in a business, you've got some core processes that say, what is the customer paying us to do? The customer is paying us to design and develop products. Oops, sorry, I just hit the go button. To produce what it is they want from us. They're paying us to manage their orders all the way through from, we have a sales process. We accept the order in. We make sure it gets delivered. And then there may be a service and repair process on the other end of that. That would be an example of a typical core processes of a product-based business. Management has its responsibilities across the top here, the things like strategic planning and business development and how they review and appraise performance of the business and of the people. And then their support processes often managed by the staff functions, the document management, information management and security, facilities management, and so on across the business there. Where internal audit is one of the support processes of the business. Notice, we don't have departments across the bottom. We don't have the facilities department or the quality department or the HR department across the bottom. The hiring and training process involves much more than the HR department, doesn't it? It involves the managers who are saying, here's who we need. It's involving the on-the-job training people. It's involving it involves HR, but it may also involve a contract service outside that goes and sources those people. It involves the evaluation of supervisors and managers to say, have people actually met the requirements? So I don't have HR department, I have hiring and training process here. Or over here, it doesn't say R&D or engineering over there. It says the design and development process. Because think, who's involved in the design and development process? Design and development isn't just a bunch of engineers. You've got marketing people. You may have some sales people contributing. You may have field service support people giving their input to it. The design and development process ought to involve people from production who are saying, don't do that, or I can't build it. You're going to have you're going to have the sourcing people saying, well, we can do that, but you've got a 6-month lead time on developing that part and bringing it in. All right? So the design and development process involves lots of different functions. So when I say determine your key processes, you need to look at not just departments. You need to look at processes and who's involved in a process. Okay, next, when you are improving your your audit program management, you need to be looking at what are the applicable standards, applicable requirements of the standard, other requirements, and set up a requirements matrix to show which key processes apply. This is one of the things that we do within the 2-day process-based audit class. Now, a lot of you are going to be familiar with the kind of example that I'm going to show on the next page. We're going to dig into this in the 2-day class. If you're not familiar with this, it's going to brush by really quickly. But here's an example. This is a company that said, well, what are the requirements of our own internal management system that have to be met, and what are all the processes of our business? I know it's kind of small, but most of you are probably looking at this on a computer screen in front of you and ought to be able to follow along. The distribution company. They quote, they make sure they can produce it, they buy the parts, they do some light assembly work in this company, they ship the parts. They also have a receiving process for the stuff that they bring in to build the process with. Their invoicing process is within their quality management system, and so on across the top here. So each one of these processes, for example, let's look at the shipping process. Well, the shipping process, we don't say we're looking at the shipping department. It may have multiple people involved in the shipping process. So we're looking at the shipping process, and when we go out and audit the shipping process, we're going to look at requirements for document and record control. We're going to look at requirements for training and qualification. Within the shipping process, we've got elements of the purchasing process that apply because that had the return to vendor process was involved in shipping there, so we included that there. Identification and traceability, how do they number parts, how do they keep track of what they've got where. Packaging, handling, and storage, customer satisfaction. This is just the way this business defined these requirements and whether they apply to the shipping process. These are not ISO clauses. These are the requirements of their business that they were meeting. Also, whenever they audit a process, they're going to go back through and look at when was your last internal audit, what was discussed, what continual improvements were you making there, did you follow through on those items, and they're going to verify that those things are in place. They're going to look at non-conforming product in that process, and they're going to look at measures and analysis in that process. So this, a matrix like this, tells an auditor, when I go out to audit a process, which clauses actually apply. I gave you a simplified example here, but I'm going to give you a real-world example of an audit that happened recently for one of my clients and show you how they use this matrix to say, how do we work? How do we look against all these requirements? So this is a clause applicability matrix, and within the workshop, you'll be given an assignment to go back and look at, within the 2-day class, you'll be given an assignment to go back and say, are we doing this in our own business? And if not, why not? And what else can we be doing? Okay, in audit program management, based on this matrix, with all of these processes across the top, the audit program manager then goes and says, all right, let's look at all those processes and sprinkle them throughout the year so we're not doing all our audits all in the same month, because the fact is typically the same people wind up responding to audits, whatever the audit may be, because you got a few key process owners that wind up doing a lot of stuff. So let's spread it out over the course of the year. So I have had clients who say we do wall-to-wall audits. It's kind of like a physical inventory instead of cycle counting. So some companies do that. Most companies will sprinkle it throughout the year in my experience. All right, so that was how you manage an audit program, some of the principles behind process-based auditing and managing an audit program. And now we're going to move on into what an individual auditor, lead auditor and their team, would do in planning an audit. So remember, auditors need to be independent not ignorant of the work they're auditing. Take you back to that company that I said, horror story, where they had the facilities manager and the administrative professional and the accountant performing audits of software. One of the results of that class was that the top management said, you know, we don't want to train those people to understand the process. And they've got their own jobs to do. And we don't want to take our people who are knowledgeable of the processes, working in the processes, and train them to be auditors. They said, Karen, Rod, Dave, get your folks, come in here and take over our audit program. Our quality manager will administer the program, but we're going to have you guys function as contract auditors for us, perform the audits, tell us what we need to know, what we need to do differently, verify that we've done our corrective action. Okay, so they had us study their processes. They had us follow through and say, are they actually effective in their business? What do they need to know that they don't know? Be their eyes and ears. And then they had their internal folks follow along and coordinate the who needs to be where, coordinate the paperwork, but we were the eyes and ears that perform the audits. We do that for a number of our clients, and it gives them very insightful audits, much more insightful than they may get from people who really don't understand how good is good. You know, what does it take to be good enough? So when an auditor goes out to study a process, this diagram is something that we use in the process-based audit class to say, how do you study a process so that you know if it's effective? And this kind of goes back to that yellow grid that I gave you a little while ago that says you need to understand the inputs and outputs of the process, what comes into the process, and what do you provide at the exit of the process, and who owns that process. So who's responsible for things like, how often does this process happen? Who's setting up the measures for how good is good enough on this? What procedures are being followed? What skills and competencies need to be in place here? And what kind of tools and equipment do we need? In the two-day class, we go through saying, well, when you're looking at the special skills and competence, this is where you're looking at the requirements that are stated in ISO 9001 Clause 6.2. So you're going to come up with checklist questions related to, are people properly trained? Do we have training records to back that up? When you're looking at how is this process performed, when you study the process and say how is it performed, you're looking at the requirements of 7 point whatever, could be 7.4, 7.5. You're looking at the how is the output measured here. Those are requirements that are found in Clause 8 of ISO 9001, and you come up with checklist questions for that. I'm not going to belabor this point in the interest of time, but this is what we study. How do you study a process? We teach that in the two-day audit course. And here's an example of a process within a hospital that says, gee, you've got management-oriented processes, you've got support processes in the middle, and then you've got the patient-oriented processes in the middle. The people who are performing those audits are going to prepare one of these process requirements diagrams for each one of these processes. So to do a process-based audit, you do a lot of study up front. And that's what we teach about in process-based auditing. How do you study a process so that you can develop a model like this, and we go through these kinds of questions that you would be asking. Now, you guys, there is a lot of information on these 3 gray pages that I'm going through. You'll be able to download this presentation next week. You'll get an email that will say, how do you download the presentation? And you can actually download a video of a Windows video of just what you're seeing on the screen right here, complete with my stumbling voice going through it all, so rapid-fire speech. Or you can look through it at your own pace and say, are we asking these kinds of questions when we study a process and prepare our checklist? Are we actually getting the effectiveness of the process? That's what these questions are designed to lead you to do. Now, who actually gets audited? When you study a process, what you need to do is start with the process owner. Well, who's the process owner? When you've got a process like a design process that involves so many different functions getting their fingers involved in it, who is the process owner? Who decided what gates we have to go through to get a product from concept to ready for production? Well, the organization needs to define that process owner for each of its key processes, and that's the person who's accountable and responsible for the implementation, the measurement, and improvement of the process. They can change the process, and that process owner, when you're studying the process up front, will tell you how things are supposed to work. That process owner, because they need to report this to management with some regularity, should be able to show you data indicating the process does work as planned, and they should be able to point out corrective and preventive actions, cost-saving improvements and such that they've done in that process over time. So when you audit a process, you typically start with that process owner, and you may do some study with them up front. In our webinar on internal auditors, how do you get them engaged and how do you build their skills, we talk about how do you get engaged with the process owners so that they want you to come and audit and so that they do something with the results. A lot of it is studying the process up front and understanding what they're looking for verification that they're doing. If everything is working as it's supposed to, you ought to be able to go back to them and say, I've gathered enough evidence here that I can tell you the process is working as you've designed it. Now, if you're not getting the results that you want, or if you want to step up the goals, here are the areas to focus on. So you talk to the process owner about what it's supposed to look like, what the measurements they're hoping to get are, how do they know the process is working as planned. A couple weeks ago, I was in a facility working with them on their quality management system, and I said, well, how often does this process fail? It was an assembly process we were looking at that moment. And I asked the manager, and she said, well, we make our schedule every day, or we work overtime on the weekends. And I'm like, well, do you have any measurements up front along the line that are telling you, are you doing the right things to get those results? I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, so basically what she was doing, it's kind of like somebody who's starving themselves to death to maintain their weight. Okay, they had a lot of people working very hard, going back, doing rework, or checking up on things on the line without any idea of were they overdoing it or underdoing it. They just made up for it somewhere along the line in the process. Well, I went over and I asked the gal at the end of the line who was performing the QC checks. I said, how often do you have to send something back for rework? Out of every 10 of these do you have to send something back? And she said, oh, once or twice. So then, during the week that I was there, I gave the process owner, she's actually the production supervisor, I gave her an assignment to go back and study how many items had been produced, how many had been reworked, how much extra labor was applied than she thought according to standards should be applied. She went through, she ran the numbers, and you know what? They had an 85% yield on the process, which was consistent with what the operator at the end of the line knew. So there were no official process measures of how they were doing. The gal at the end of the line knew once or twice out of every 10 I have to send something back. And I asked the supervisor, what if you only had to send it back once out of every 20? What would that do to your capacity? What would that do to your overtime? She's like, oh, you could see the scales falling from her eyes. Maybe if we measured this stuff, we might be able to see where the fallout is. So ask the people on the line to show you, does it really work as planned and what's not working well? That's how you audit in a process-based audit. Now, how do you perform a process-based audit? Well, you need to talk to the manager and the process owner about what are the goals, what kinds of problems are they seeing, what's been changing. You need to look for customer complaints, and you need to look for corrective and preventive action. In my webinar, in the DESARA Group's webinar on ISO 9001 that we're doing this afternoon, there's still slots if anybody wants to sign up. We talk about corrective action and customer complaints as an auditor's playground. Okay, that is where auditors, professional auditors, effective auditors like to start their audit. They sit down with the management and they say, what are the goals? What kinds of problems have you seen? We do an interview and we find out what the management is saying. And then, here's a little auditor secret. You go and you look at the corrective action log and you see how many of those things are showing up in the corrective and preventive action log. It's scary. The things that management tells you are problems are not listed as corrective and preventive actions. You know what's listed in the corrective and preventive action log? RMAs, things that got returned to the company to fix. But they're not the bigger overall overriding problems that are creating the stuff. It's not a listing of where are we really looking for the causes of all these RMAs. There are no projects opened against those kinds of things listed in the corrective and preventive action log. Where is the corrective and preventive action actually happening? It's by brute force, by well-meaning people, by teams that say, let's solve this problem. They're not using the management system and the measurements to audit the processes, to improve the processes. So that's one thing when you're auditing a process. You're looking for effective corrective and preventive action related to management's goals and related to customer complaints. We take a big section of the 2-day class on this, on how do you go out and find out those things, and we do some case studies to show how you do that, that detective work to find out, are things working the way they're supposed to. Also, in auditing a process, this is auditing 101. Follow the work in the process in a logical path. Start with the inputs, work to the outputs, or start with the outputs of completed order and work through in reverse order how was it produced, or a completed design project, for example. Take a sample of work in process at each key decision point. So every time somebody says, well, this could go back for rework, that's where you're taking a sample of the work to say how, let's take a look at the last, at 10 of these over the last quarter and see how many of them actually failed. You're telling me you've got 100% first pass yield? Show me. So take a sample of completed work, a sample of work in process, so that you can make an informed judgment of whether the process is working by what the measurements are telling you, by what the people are telling you. You're corroborating all that evidence. Do a sanity check with actual performance and keep fantastic notes. This is my downfall as an auditor. It is my absolute downfall. I teach this stuff, and I'm terrible at it. I would show you, but it would take too much time. I ought to work it in here. I was auditing with a partner who took his iPhone out on the line. This is a business where that was allowed. I know that's not actually allowed in a lot of businesses. He took his iPhone out. He took pictures of documents, pictures of practices, pictures of things. You know, when I had my house inspected and the auditor came out and the building inspector came out and took photographs and embedded them in his inspection report versus the usual scrawled checklist, I'm like, I like this guy. Whenever I have any inspections done, I'm gonna use this guy. When you can go out and take photographs or take notes that show what you actually saw, nobody's going to be able to question you and say that's just your opinion. So what this guy does is he takes the photographs and embeds them in his report, or he takes them and embeds them in a spiral notebook. He prints them out, tapes them in, and shows, here's what I actually saw, and then he hands those notes over with his audit. Oh my gosh. People, if you've ever been asked to close a corrective action and you see what the auditor wrote down, sometimes it's really hard to figure out what they were thinking. The better notes you keep, the more respected you'll be as an auditor, the more valuable your audit will be to people, because in an internal audit, people will come back to you and say, what were you thinking? That's not the way it happens. And then you can show them your notes. Now, in practice, what you're looking for in a process-based audit is the process effective? Now, what is a customer looking for? A customer is looking for speed. You know, did you meet the schedule? Did you meet the promise that you gave them? They're looking for quality. Did you actually produce what I wanted you to do, and did you do it the right way? And they're looking for cost. You know, they want to be sure that you can meet what it is you're supposed to. I don't know if that's a ringtone or if somebody put us on hold, but we're going to get that on the recording if we're not careful. So, folks, I'm going to mute everyone, and then I'm going to unmute myself so that we don't have to listen to somebody's on-hold music. How's that as a... Okay, I'm still on. You guys ought to be able to hear me. Folks, if you would, I keep saying folks, that's not nice. It's kind of southern of me. Raise your hand if you can still hear me so I can see I'm not muted. Great. I see a hand go up. At least one person raised a hand. Thank you. I'll keep talking then. I'm going to lower all the hands now. Thank you. Okay, so is the process effective? What customers want is speed, quality, and cost. They want to know that the product is what they wanted. They want to know that they got it on time. That is exactly what internal processes want of the preceding process. So as an auditor of an internal process, or as an auditor who's auditing internal processes for your supplier, and you're looking at your customer, and you're looking at your supplier's processes, you should be looking at, are we getting the speed and the quality and doing it the right way? That's how you know this thing is actually effective. As an auditor, look at things like cycle time. Look at things like supplier relations. And by the way, when it says supplier relations, hey, when you're in an internal audit situation and you're looking at everything that comes into this process comes from someone else in the business, tell me, how are they communicating with their process before them? Are they, I mean, they may not have a choice in supplier selection, but are they actually allowing their internal supplier to give them what they want? Are they actually complaining in an effective way that gives data on what the problem was that led, you know, if you're just complaining and saying we never get good inputs, are you opening corrective actions against your internal suppliers, or at least handling that in an informal way that gets results? So as an internal auditor, look for those. Am I asking my internal suppliers for corrective actions? This is not just an external point. Now, I promised you I would show you an example of an actual audit using this approach. Now, this is an audit where I went out. It's a manufacturer and distributor of fiber optic cables and other kinds of wires. They take customer orders and build custom cables to meet them. So this is an example of these open items are still open, haven't been audited yet. This was a daily report of how they stood on it. And this is a TL 9000 audit. Now, if you were just auditing ISO 9001, you'd have 751, 752, 3, 4, 5, and 6. All these little additional requirements are additional requirements telecommunications puts on their folks who are certified. This particular supplier had a number of exemptions. We didn't have to audit those. And we go through and we say, did they have a major nonconformity, a minor nonconformity that we list in yellow, or were they okay? So several people were out performing this audit, and we all came back and put our findings on this one grid. We went out and audited the receiving process. And of course, we didn't just say we're auditing Clause 7.5. I'm just showing you a snippet of this. Where they audited Clause 7. This is a piece of the audit of the receiving department, and we found a major nonconformity and 3 minors. And then we went on to audit the requirements of Clause 8 and the requirements of Clause 5 and 6 and stuff as they applied to each of these. So this is an example of a process-based audit. You go out and audit the cutting department, go out and audit the copper line, the fiber line, the telephony line. And I'm going to actually show you a little snippet of what this looks like in practice. I've got to do this so that it's sanitized for their protection. Okay. I'm going to pull this down in and show you the spreadsheet for this particular company. Whoops. So that you can see when you actually do a process-based audit, what do you wind up with? I've made it very small so you can't see what all they've got and who they are. But they've got their processes across the top. I guess I can make this a little bit bigger. So when we set up this audit, we go across the top line, just like in that grid that I showed you before. What are their processes of the business? We go down the left side and we list all the requirements that they're required to meet. And by the way, this is a business that's just getting started on its TL 9000, so we would expect them to have a lot of major nonconformities because there are new requirements that they haven't met yet. And as we go down, oops, I'm going to go up here. As we go down for a given process, when we went out to audit, for example, the shipping process, we went all the way down this column and said, let's look at all the different clauses that apply and make sure that we verify that they have met those requirements when we audit the process. So you can see going down a particular column, we get the yeses, the nos, the okays, and the maybes, and the things that still have to be audited along there. Okay, raise your hand if this kind of thing that I've just gone through describing makes sense to you. Whoa. I'm getting a sampling of the hands raised, and I'm just going to hope that everybody that didn't raise their hand is going to sign up for the class in May where we'll go through this in great detail. It is a lot to cover in a 1-hour webinar, how experienced auditors who are doing process-based audits actually set up their audits and go out and do them. We are almost out of time. If you can stay on the line, I hope you will, and we'll go through the last 3 or 4 slides here and I'm sorry I ran over. Guess I get a little excited about what we're talking about here. And I will answer questions for people who are still on the line. I just lowered all the hands. I'll answer questions for folks who are still on the line after this. And I'm going to go ahead and try to unmute everybody when we get to the end, but I'm afraid that Mr. Hold Music has probably still got us on hold because now it's the top of the hour. Let's see, I need to go down here. Customers care about quality, cost, and speed. So does your organization from the perspective of your internal processes. So when you go out and audit an internal process, as a process-based audit, you need to be thinking from the perspective of the next process in line. Are they getting the quality, cost, and speed they expect out of that preceding process? Now, in practice, when you go out and do reporting, you need to talk in terms of the process owners and the manager's interests. So don't go out and say you didn't meet clause 7.5.1 subpart A. You go out and say you didn't meet your cost goal, or you didn't meet your speed goal, or you didn't, the overtime was high in this department, and here's some of the things that resulted in why that happened. The parts of the process that broke down. Get their attention by speaking the language of management. Highlight the ineffectiveness in a corrective action system using the data. Look how many times we had this problem, and all we did about it was flog the person who did it wrong, otherwise known as retraining. When you go out to close an audit, what you need to do, and this was actually, I did a poll, and I found out that lack of timely or sufficient corrective action and attention to opportunities for improvement is one of the most, is the most frequently cited frustration for auditors. Process owners, according to ISO 9001, are responsible for taking action without undue delay. So if you're frustrated by that as an auditor, you need to go out and write up that organization. They didn't take corrective action without undue delay. And if they say, gee, 3 months is not undue delay, you need to work with the organization to define what is undue delay. When we get into the 2-day class, I will show you how I personally overcame this idea of undue delay in an organization where I worked. I said, how are we going to make people pony up and get these things done? Now, audits can't be closed. This is a new requirement of ISO 9001-2008, or it's always been a requirement, but it was clarified. You can't close the audit until the organization has completed verification of actions and the reporting of the verification results. We'll go through what that means and how you can use that to drive people to more effective action. Okay, I'm basically done with the presentation now. I want you to know that within your audit program, you need to be setting goals, making sure the resources are there, using consistent and effective methods, and performing and you need to be checking up on the performance of the audit program. You also need to be looking at those major points. So that is what 9001 asks of every process. When you go out to perform an audit, ask if they have goals, if they have resources, if they're working to methods, and what are the checks on the process that show they're getting those goals. In a nutshell, this is what process-based auditing means. Okay. I want to reiterate what we've got coming up. The virtual conference in June 29th, 30th, and 1st, filled with outstanding speakers about personal, team, and organizational effectiveness. Only $797. Basically, as many people as you want to pack into a conference room can attend. I really hope you guys will start talking that up. I'll be sending out announcements about that and tell you who some of the speakers are. You will really enjoy this if you're able to make the time to come. Should not interfere, should be a very cost-effective way to get some new ideas into the business. And I wanted to reiterate, I gave you the dates up front. The 2-day course that we'll be offering on process-based auditing is Tuesday and Wednesday. Where is it? Got it right here. Tuesday and Wednesday, process-based audits for business effectiveness. It's $597. I believe you guys will be getting a discount. I got to check with our marketing department on that, but I believe you guys will be getting a discount, and I'm not sure what, but watch your mail. You'll get the stuff that says, how do we implement this stuff in our business? So now I'm going to open the lines and hope that Mr. Hold Music has taken us off. Sure I'm not muting myself here. Hang on, I'm not unmuting everyone. Guess I'm going to unmute you all individually as we go through. I'm unmuting people. Please start talking so I can see if I've got you unmuted as I click on your name. And those of you who didn't have, somebody say something. Please. Did I end the call with nobody on the call with me? I know we've gone over.
I'm still on the call.
Thank you, everyone. I thought, what if everybody left? I threw a party and nobody came. Okay, we are at the end of the time. The phone lines are open. People can ask questions. If you'd like me to call on you so that you don't feel like you're stepping on somebody, raise your hand. I'll call on people in order of the hands raised, and we'll talk about some of these slides that may have been confusing or other questions you have about improving the effectiveness of process-based audits in your company. So thank you, everyone, for attending. Let's pause for a moment for the folks who need to hang up and get on with their lunchtime or the rest of their day. And I hope you'll join us this afternoon and tomorrow for some of our webinars that will be coming up. We've got some more in a couple weeks. Bye-bye, everyone, and I'll stay on the line. Okay, I'm watching people hang up. It looks like we've got about a half dozen people still on the line. So if you're on the line, you have a question, raise your hand. I'll call on you by first name. I'm going to stop the recording.